By the end of October 1805, the Corps of Discovery, with co-captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, were approaching the Columbia River Gorge with growing excitement and renewed hope of finally reaching the end of a roughly 3,800-mile exploration of the Louisiana Territory and beyond. It was deep autumn, and signs of winter, like cold nights, were adding to the urgency. The group of almost 40 Americans were essentially adrift across the relatively dry, flat, high plains of the Columbia River Plateau. But their boats were entering a changing geography and climate between heavily forested slopes of the Cascades mountain chain and warmer, wetter coastal mountains and valleys. Passing the mouth of today's Walla Walla River, the captains knew they were in territory explored already, some 13 years earlier by George Vancouver of Great Britain. Lewis was carrying copies of Vancouver's published maps and watching for landmarks. He observed a conical, snow-covered mountain to the southwest that had been named Mount Hood by a member of Vancouver's party. Clark indicated another high mountain covered with snow might be Mount St. Helens, also named by a Vancouver lieutenant. He may have mistaken this for Mount Adams nearby.
To the eastward is a range of about 50 or 60 miles distance, which bear north and south, but neither in the low grounds nor in the highlands is any timber to be seen. To the west, at the distance of about 150 miles, is a very high mountain covered with snow.
From its direction and appearance, Clark supposed it to be
the Mount St. Helens, laid down by Vancouver as visible from the mouth of the Columbia.
The party decamped on October 20, soon encountering a chain of black rocks on the Washington side of the Columbia. On the south side, a low plain and not a tree to be seen in any direction except for willows along the banks. Ducks were shot to provide some scarce nourishment, but there was barely enough fuel to cook them. Ahead was the Great Falls of the Columbia, then labeled Cholila Falls, today submerged. The conical Mount Hood brooded in the distance. Days later, on October 22, more Indian lodges were passed, as was the broad Deschutes River, inflow from today's Oregon. Clark named that river for the Chinook word for enemies, because the local peoples feared certain tribes living upstream to the south, likely Snake or Paiute Indians. After Cholito Falls, a roughly 50-mile stretch of rapids, now underwater due to damming, introduced the expeditioners to the Wishram-Wesco people. It was the unique design of their canoes that was most admired by the captains. Lewis traded a small canoe of his, plus a hatchet and trinkets for one of those boats, and sailed on to a new camp called Fort Rock, staying there until October 28 to dry out cargo in patch canoes. Now it was raining almost constantly, although hunting was good, especially for deer and geese, and the Indians seemed very friendly. More Indians appeared, both in communities beside the river and traveling by in canoes. The riverbanks were well populated by Walla Walla Indians. The explorers camped among them. One-eyed private Pierre Cruzat pleased the admiring villagers with his violin again. The captains promised to stay longer on their return next spring. Further down the Columbia, a river was named in honor of Cruzat. To the inhabitants of another village on October 28, Clark was very complimentary. The inhabitants were unusually hospitable and good-humored.
So that we gave to the place the name of Friendly Village. We breakfast here.
The core of discovery is on the spacious lands of the Columbia Plateau. Here some of the people were wearing scarlet and blue cloth robes. One had on a sailor's jacket, all signs that the party was nearing the Pacific coast, where traders on ships had already landed in the past. The going rate for fish was high, though, too high, to the displeasure of the explorers, and the captains now had only a limited supply of gifts. Still, most of the tribes were welcoming. The Discovery Corps encountered for the first time since St. Louis Indians living in wood plank houses. Clark, invited into one of them, found it
Large and commodious.
He wrote that these people paddled, quote, elegant canoes and practiced infant head flattening. Lewis replaced one dugout with a lightweight Chinook canoe, which is, quote, wide in the middle, tapering at each end, and decorated with carved figures in the hull. Passing more narrows, the explorers spent the next 3 days drying out gear, repairing canoes, and hunting in the wooded foothills of Mount Hood. On October 29 and 30, they approached an area that is today called the Dalles. a more lush western forest of the Columbia River Gorge, where the wet climate of the Pacific coast meets the Cascades mountain range amid mossy rock slopes. Hood and St. Helens, noted by the party, are volcanic peaks that are part of this range. Much of the white water from this point on today is tamed by the Bonneville Dam. According to the journals,
after being so long accustomed to the dreary nakedness of the country above, the change is grateful to the eye, and it is useful in supplying us with fuel. Here were great numbers of waterfowl, such as swan, geese, ducks, storks, cormorants, cranes, plovers, and the white and gray brant, of which last we killed 18.
Then on November 3, working through a fog, the captains named a new creek the Seal River, maybe having observed seals for the first time, or possibly sea otters. The explorer party were camped on the river in a place we today call Portland, Oregon. The crews moved on downriver to the Sandy River and finally reached present-day Vancouver, Washington, and mouth of the Willamette River. Lieutenant William Broughton of George Vancouver's expedition of 1792 was here more than a decade before. Finally, after another foggy morning on November 7,
Ocean in view, oh the joy!
Captain Clark wrote in his notes. They still hadn't reached the bay's mouth, but breakers could be heard crashing against the shore. Clark also wrote,
Ocean 4,142 miles from the mouth of the Missouri River.
It wasn't the actual ocean, but the estuary mouth, and close enough. The advance was still precarious, and the travelers were greeted with a notorious coastal welcome of about 11 straight days of rain, accompanied by turbulent tides and wind. They remained pinned down and mostly drenched most of the time. Captain Lewis apparently wrote nothing at all, nor is there any record of his actual feelings about the monumental achievement this long-planned journey had fulfilled. He had stopped writing weeks before already. Again, no one knows why. Bad weather tested the core of Discovery again, dampening more than clothing. The expeditioner's spirits also sagged. From Stephen Ambrose's recounting of Clark's realistic assessment of the situation on November 12,
"It would be distressing to a feeling person to see our situation at this time, all wet and cold, without our bedding, etc. Also wet, in a cove scarcely large enough to contain us. Canoes at the mercy of the waves and driftwood. Robes and leather clothes are rotten."
their objective now was to find shelter that would last a full season. Winter. No sign of ships or white men. The Chinooks, who the captains viewed distastefully and suspiciously, were inclined to petty thievery. These people eventually were replaced by a more respectful but related community of Native Americans, the Clatsops. On November 15,
About 3 o'clock, the wind lulled and the river became calm. I had the canoes loaded in great haste and set out from this dismal niche where we have been confined for 6 days past without the possibility of proceeding on.
Clark. Corps members Gass and Whitehouse concluded that the party has accomplished the intention of the expedition, now in plain view of the Pacific Ocean. The waves rolling and the surf roaring very loud.